Thank you, Michael, for that comprehensive overview and looking at some of the challenges we face with these large energy numbers. And you also talked about universal access to water, which we also discuss. I mean, even in the energy, we're focusing on energy today, but really when we're looking at poverty and eliminating poverty, it's not only energy, there's water, food, and other topics that you've touched on. I think these are all relevant. So now we've had these three speakers, and I think we have some 10 minutes or so. I'd be happy to open the floor up for any questions or discussion if you'd like to address to the panelists. Yes, ma'am. Please use the microphone if you can come up to a desk. Thank you.
Oh, okay. My name is Lucy Webster, and I retired UN official and worked for the Center for War Peace Studies. Now, associated with Economists for Peace and Security. My question is, can anyone on the panel identify a way that money could now be invested in creating green jobs, which in a way that would generate the resources to deal with some of the challenges which have been identified? Can we generate the wherewithal to do it? And can we generate it in a way which creates jobs and empowers the nation, other nations too?
Paul?
Thanks for your question. That is actually one of the key benefits of strong public-private partnerships. And certainly if we have the enabling environments, and I don't mean ecological environments, I mean financial and the other aspects to have these co-benefits happen, that will very much help sustain this financial recycling of investments so that we can sustain the deployment of these technologies going forward. I think he certainly made it clear, as did our first speaker, that this is not just about ecology, it's about social and economic development. And once you put those in place, you tend then to get revenues, tax revenues off of strongly working economies that can be recycled back into social programs. And so the key, I think, is to have a fundamental, strong energy basis for any country. And from there, good things happen.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else? Naki?
I agree with this position. I just wanted to add a few sentences to that I think are important. Many of the things that we are talking about in this in the new development direction mean that we would go to more capital-intensive type of financing. This is why efficiency is important, because you can reduce the amount of energy to be produced. But nevertheless, most of the sustainable pathways from efficiency to renewables and the access technologies will require relatively high capital intensiveness, which means slightly different business models are required, because until now, we invest in the short term, relatively low capital intensive options, and expect rates of return in the short run. This transformational change would be cost effective in the long run, but we need to have institutional support for that, because the private sector, I think, is hesitant today because of the multiple risks facing such investments. If you go back to last year, 2009, the investments in the renewables worldwide went down by 40%, in the fossils by 20%. So we need new frameworks. I think this is a real important thing that concerns both private and public partnerships, but also market regulation, incentives for the private sector to make this big investment. So I don't think it's the lack of capital, it's the lack of vision that that will bring many, many benefits. So out of the risk hedging reasons, we are not taking this transformational change, which I think is necessary.
Thank you, Naki. Any other comments, questions? Yes, please.
Okay. Austin Lynn, Procter & Gamble. Question on, actually, Dr. Weber brought up a great point. A lot of what some of the topics of this conference have been focusing on is building infrastructure, funding, sustainability, and the growth of the infrastructure is certainly one of our current challenges that we face. In terms of more global initiatives, what's being done, or from your perspective, on the consumer level? So again, back to Dr. Weber's example, no matter how much infrastructure we create, if the consumptive practices aren't changed at the consumer level, how do you see those challenges playing into some of the initiatives we're trying to hit?
I want to make sure I understand your question. You're talking about consumer behavior by the richer consumptive countries, or consumer behavior by the countries who are just starting their consumption patterns?
I would say it's a combination of both. One is the richer consumptive countries, as you said. Texans understand that there's this gap, but can you convince a Texan to do less? And so maybe use that as an example for how we could educate the new countries entering such consumptive practices to kind of cut it off at the pass.
So there are a couple comments I'll make. First is for the countries who are just starting their path of energy consumption, we know the path is upward. And that's probably a good thing. We probably want that for a whole variety of reasons. But they have the opportunity, because they don't have legacy infrastructure, to leapfrog the United States or other countries to put in a better infrastructure. The example that's often used is with telephones, where we string wires around the country, but in a lot of developing nations, they go straight to cellular and wireless with poles. So the infrastructure is easier, faster, and actually a higher performance system in many respects. Can we do the same thing with energy laws in these countries? Instead of laying out hundreds of thousands of miles of pipelines and transmission lines, can we go distributed, local, more resilient, maybe it feels more expensive up front, but is much cheaper in the long run kind of systems that have higher performance in some respects? It's the same kind of Galapagos Island challenge you see here. Well, if you don't have ability to build infrastructure, what can you do? What are the challenges? Do you have to have storage or whatever? So I think with the countries just starting their path of energy consumption, they have a chance to leapfrog the world on technology. And I would think the rich countries would see this as a good opportunity to sell some really good technologies. This is not bad for business. This is good for business. In terms of the United States and Europe or Japan and Australia, the more highly consumptive countries, can we change our behavior? In many respects, Europe already has. Europeans consume half the energy as Americans, and as a consequence, don't really have a lifespan that's any shorter, aren't any less happy, don't have an economy that's any worse. So there's a sign here that we can change our energy consumption in America while still having long, healthy, happy, affluent lives. There are some fundamental differences between America and Europe in terms of population density and size of the continent, but those are things we can overcome. And so this argument in America has been made slowly over the last 3 decades. They did it in California starting in the 70s. They call it the Rosenfeld effect, where per capita electricity consumption in California has been level for decades without it hurting the economy or other things. And meanwhile, America's energy or electricity consumption has increased over that time. Well, now it's starting for the rest of the nation, even Texas. Texas' electricity consumption leveled off a few years ago. So we might be starting what California did 30 years ago. We're just 3 decades behind. So I think this argument can be made, but people are so worried about losing their quality of life or their money, you have to sort of articulate in a way that says this isn't a threat to your way of life or your money. It can be good. In fact, you can improve your quality of life, because if you spend less on utilities or gasoline, you have more money to spend on going to the movies or travel or whatever it is you want to do. I think that argument's now being made the right way, but it hasn't been made the right way for about 3 or 4 decades. I think it's starting.
Thank you, Michael. I'll call on Paul Luffelman to make a brief comment.
Thanks. I'll share a couple of insights from our Galapagos experience that may also help address us. In the context of electricity in the Galapagos, first time wind turbines ever there. An enormous amount of national pride and local pride for this. And so as we introduced the turbines, we also introduced the concept of energy efficiency. And we explained that the wind that we were capturing there was the best amount and only amount on that island that we could capture so that they could afford it. And so basically, even though all of us in the room knows the wind blows everywhere on the planet, what we explained was that we were limited to 3 wind turbines on an island because of an endangered bird that lived nearby. And so they had to be extremely careful with that new wind electricity. And they got it. The message is clear. They are trying to reduce their consumption there because they're proud of this new technology and they don't want to screw it up. This would be, I think, the same thing around the world where we're introducing new baseload generation, new intermittent generation, new storage, new smart grid. There's a pride factor there, and they want to make sure that it keeps working for them. So the combination of energy efficiency training, the affordability aspects, I think, can all play together in order to reduce that overall consumption.
Thank you, Paul. John?
Thank you. John German speaking here for the United Nations Public-Private Alliance for Rural Development. Dr. Naxinovich had a very interesting word on his slide, which you don't often see in these fora, and that is the word subsidies. And to put it in the simplest possible terms, the reason that a lot of people and institutions and organizations see environmentally friendly, sustainable sources of energy as being expensive is that they're competing with subsidies for coal, oil, and atomic power. What does it take to get the kind of legislative and regulatory environment that will require total transparency of all subsidies? I'm thinking of the kind of transformational effect that it had when in the United States the environmental impact statement was introduced. And one of the things I've been personally advocating for is a financial impact statement, on everything, but not just financial impact day one, total life cycle costing of financial impact. And subsidies are a big part of this. In the food side, the agricultural side, there's the famous example of the Swiss cow, which has more subsidies than the income of most people in those billions that were on your slides. So what is the story on subsidies? How do we get transparency on this? Because without that, we're talking about basically competing with what amounts to free goods, and that's impossible. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're addressing absolutely the key question, because to achieve the transformational change, we need level playing field. And we are so strongly locked in the world of subsidies. And some of them are, for good reasons, very difficult to get rid of, because we subsidize fuel that's essential